Peter Grandpre, Grandpre, age 36.
And he is the name of the deceased.
He is the deceased individual, yes.
Grand Prix.
Grandpre, yeah.
Okay. And then, I guess, are we ready to start
Do you
with
want
the
to,
formal
if you
interview
all
now?
are ready, you want to just say whatever, basically what happened today, sir?
Yeah, about 1:51 this morning, our dispatch received a call from a female who advised that she'd been in an argument with her husband. They were at 604 South Clark Street. The individual, the female caller advised that her husband had armed himself with 2 pistols as well as a rifle, and she was requesting that we respond to the scene. Our officers began responding to the scene. The initial officer arrived on the scene and was able to see the individual inside the residence armed with the rifle. The officer then approached the front of the residence. The individual at some point put the rifle down. I don't believe the individual knew the officer was standing near the front door of the residence, and the individual came to the front door and opened the door. At that point, the officer started giving the individual verbal commands. The individual did not comply, and he stepped back into the living room area of the residence, drew a handgun from behind his back, maybe in his belt or in a pouch. He was wearing a load-bearing military-type vest, and pointed it at the officer and began firing the pistol at the officer. At that point, the officer then returned fire. Both the officer and suspect fired multiple shots, and the suspect was fatally injured in the incident.
So when because there was one officer, is that because only one officer initially responded? Like when the initial call came in, only one officer responded? Is that how that happened?
No, there was actually 5 officers that responded to the scene. The initial officer arrived and was just basically conducting a reconnaissance to see what he could see. Other officers were actually pulling up when the gunfire erupted.
What was the gentleman that, the man with the gun, he fired first, is what we're saying?
Well, it's hard to say. From looking at the video, he steps back inside the residence and pulls his gun, and at that point, shots are exchanged.
Do we know how many shots were between?
We don't know exactly right now. The Division of Criminal Investigation is working on that right now to determine the exact number of shots and where each individual's rounds actually went.
Was your officer injured at all?
No, the officer the only officer, and he was the only officer at the scene who fired his weapon, he was not injured in the incident.
So backing up really quick, the multiple shots that were fired, would you describe it as, and I think you said this, but I want to make sure it's clear, would you describe it as kind of like there was shooting back and forth before the suspect succumbed obviously to the shots? Yeah,
the officer and the suspect fired a number of rounds at each other. The officer's rounds struck the suspect multiple times, and the officer was not injured.
Was the officer struck, was he wearing a vest or anything like that? Can you say that?
The officer was wearing ballistic armor, yes.
But he was never hit?
No, the officer was never, none of the suspect's rounds struck the officer.
Oh.
Okay.
Sheriff, I want to make sure I'm clear on something. I thought you said that the suspect fired the gun first and then the officer responded, but then but now we don't know.
In looking at the video, the suspect pulls the weapon out and points it at the officer, who is also pointing his weapon. So it's difficult to determine who fired first, but there's no question in my mind, looking at the video, that the officer was wearing at the time of the incident. The officer's actions are justified, and that the individual who was firing at him was certainly attempting to kill him.
Was he wearing a body camera?
Yes, the officer involved was wearing a body camera.
And that's the video that you guys are looking at that you're referencing?
Yes, I did look at a number of things, and including the video the officer was wearing at the time of the incident.
And I'm assuming right now at the time we're not releasing, though, the name of the officer involved.
No, the name of the officer won't be released at this time.
What's the protocol for him being, is he like on paid leave pending an investigation?
Yeah,
How
the
does that
officer
work?
involved will be placed on administrative leave just until we can determine he's ready to come back to work.
And
Do you
is
have any
there-
idea of the mental state of this, we'd heard something that he may be suffering from PTSD or something. Do you know anything about
You
his
know, I
mental
can't.
state or past criminal record? Or?
I don't have anything on his past criminal record, and I don't want to speculate on what his mindset was. I can say that like I said, without a doubt in my mind, the officer's actions were justified because this individual, for whatever reason, whatever his mindset was, there's no question in my mind that he was attempting to kill the officer.
Was the wife the only other one in the house? Were there young children in there also?
No, there was 2 children in the house. I believe they were ages 4 and 6 as well.
Did they witness? Do you know if they witnessed the
I don't believe the
commotion?
children witnessed, no.
the initial call, what can you tell us about the disturbance? Because it was the wife that called.
Yeah,
What was some of the things they were saying? Like, I mean, was he threatening them? What can we know as far as...
The only thing I can say about the original call is that the wife called requesting that we respond. She was indicating that they had both thrown some items at each other and that he was in fact armed with 2 handguns and he had just picked up a rifle. And that's what our officers knew when they arrived. And then subsequently this incident occurred like I've described.
And there was drinking?
She did indicate on the 911 call that he had been drinking alcohol, yes.
You said he reached back behind him. He had a low type military vest. Can you?
He had a load-bearing vest similar to what the military wears, and he reached behind him and pulled this handgun out. It turns out after the incident was over, there was another handgun in this area of the vest as well. So he had two different handguns.
So he was wearing kind of a military...
Yes, he had a military-type vest on with a handgun in this area as well as one behind. I don't know whether he had a holster behind him or exactly what the situation was, but the weapon came from behind him in the video.
Can you tell us the caliber of the handguns?
Yes, the 2 handguns were .45 caliber semi-automatic pistols.
I was told by a neighbor they had seen him come out with a AR-15 on some day. Was there an AR-15?
No, the rifle in question that he had, that we, as far as we can tell, was a .308 caliber bolt-action rifle.
Hunting rifle?
I'm not sure whether it's a hunting rifle or a sniper rifle or a .308 caliber bolt-action rifle, though, that was also in the vicinity of the suspect.
So okay.
Is this family? I heard from someone that they have recently located to Butte. Is that true that they're newer to the Butte area?
You know, I don't know that. I don't know how long they've been living in Butte.
But you did say Idaho. You believe he was from Idaho, or where did I hear that?
No, I didn't
Okay.
say that. I'm not sure where they came from or how long they've been living in Butte.
Did he say anything to the officer, or were there any words that were exchanged? Did he,
The officer gave him verbal commands, which he refused.
which were
he,
specifically?
I don't want to get into the specifics
Okay.
of what the commands were, but it was clear that he knew that the officer was there, and then drew the handgun and fired at the officer.
And then once he was shot, the press release says that there was medical aid initiated there as well, and then he was transported to the hospital. Can you kind of talk about the aftermath of the shooting, like what occurred then?
Yeah, well, once the situation was secure and he was no longer a threat, officers assessed him, realized that he needed medical assistance immediately. A1 ambulance as well as medics from the fire department responded, and the officers who were at the scene also administered aid until the ambulance arrived at the scene, and then he was transported to St. James Hospital where he was pronounced dead.
You don't know if he was already dead on the scene?
CPR was in progress at the scene, yes.
Okay.
So he was technically still alive at the scene. Is that what that means?
Well, CPR was, they were doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation at the scene, so he was not breathing, and they were doing CPR at the scene, so obviously he was in very grave condition at the scene.
And you can't say how many times he was struck? Multiple times?
Multiple times, yes.
Okay.
I can't say exactly how many times how many gunshots he suffered.
How far away was the officer and the man? How far apart were the two?
In speaking to the investigators, it looks like they were somewhere between 5 and 10 feet apart when they exchanged gunfire.
And this was, the officer was like in the front yard on the stoop. Where
The officer was basically on the front. There's a handicap ramp that goes up to the front of the house, and the officer was basically standing very close to the front door on the cement pad there.
And he just was in the doorway, basically, the victim.
Yeah, the officer was looking in the doorway to see if he could determine what was going on in the house, and at that time the individual came out. I don't believe he was aware that the officer was standing there. He opened the door. At that time the officer began giving him verbal commands, and that's when he stepped back away from the door and drew the firearm and then started firing at the officer.
And I know, was he in the house when he got hit, or was he like outside the residence?
Yes, he was inside the residence.
Still inside,
when he,
okay.
when
So he
was,
fired through the doorway, and
yeah,
that's where the shot.
He was actually in the living room portion of the residence, which is very close to the front door. The officer was actually outside.
And no other people injured, hurt, anything like that?
Nobody else was injured in the incident, and I guess that's this really illustrates the dangers of police work and the threat that our officers face every day when they go to work. And it's a tragedy, clearly, but given the circumstances, it very likely could have ended up worse, and we could be dealing with officers who were wounded or deceased.
How, can you say, and you may not know this, but just how is the officer doing in terms of after this? Like, what is his emotional state?
You know, I spoke to the officers involved, all of the officers who were at the scene. They appear to be doing well. It's something like this, it takes some time to sink in that when you start facing your own mortality and realizing that an individual has lost his life, it takes a while to sink in, and it's stressful on all of our officers, and we'll be arranging a critical incident stress debriefing for all the officers involved as well.
One last thing, I think you've already touched on the sheriff, but the officer did everything exactly the way he's trained to do.
Yeah, he did a good job of trying to get some surveillance on the house and gather information, waiting for a backup to arrive. And when this individual came, he wasn't carrying the rifle, and it was he thought it was a good time to try and end the situation peacefully. And unfortunately, we're not always able to control what people do, and this individual decided that he would draw a firearm and start firing at the officer. And like I said before, the officer's actions are certainly justified, and there's no doubt in my mind that this individual was attempting to kill the officer that was in front of the house.
And on a point of clarity, he never knocked on the door or anything like that?
No, the officer hadn't
just
knocked on the door. The individual opened the door.
Completely unexpected.
For whatever reason, he came and opened the door, and that's when the officer took the opportunity to engage in verbal commands, and the suspect chose not to comply, and the exchange of gunfire was the result.
Anything found in the house as far as drugs, extra ammunition, anything like that maybe?
You know, the Division of Criminal Investigation is working on it right now. They'll be here for some time, so we'll get much more details about what led up to this, the individual's mindset, what he was thinking. And as much as we can gather, we'll never really know exactly what he was thinking, but we'll gather as much of that information as we can so we can determine, what he was thinking, and then we'll look at, additional items that are in the residence and potentially what was going on in this individual's mind when he decided to engage the officer in a firefight.
Do we know what the state of the wife is right now?
Our chaplain was with the wife earlier today. I don't know. Obviously, she's very distraught, and our chaplain was with her earlier this morning when I was speaking with the chaplain.
Have you ever been called to that residence for any kind of disturbance in the past?
I don't have a call history of that residence, so I don't know that whether we've had dealings with this individual or not.